Now we're going to look at a couple of different individuals who became justices of the Supreme Court. And they're going to cross paths before they're both on the court. We're going to start with this guy, Earl Warren, a white guy and a conservative Republican who was the Attorney General of California beginning in 1939 and had that job through 1942. As Attorney General of California, he was the one who presided over the internment of Japanese Americans during the war. Then, 1942, he was elected governor. And in 1948, he was chosen by the Republican nominee in the presidential election, Thomas Dewey, as his running mate. So actually, Earl Warren went to bed on election night, 1948, as the governor of California, and probably believed he was going to wake up being vice president of the United States, because you remember that was a crazy and close election. But he didn't. However, in 1953, President Eisenhower appointed him Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Now, I went over his background so that you could have an idea of who Earl Warren was and who people in general, the public, thought that Earl Warren was. Well, it's going to be interesting. The other person we're going to look at is this guy, Thurgood Marshall, who at the time that our narrative is taking place with Earl Warren as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall is a lawyer for the NAACP. Now, his background's pretty interesting. His father had been a Pullman porter, and his father had been a slave. And his father, Thurgood Marshall's great grandfather, had actually been captured from the Congo and sold into slavery. So, 4 generations, this family, this line, went from being kidnapped in Africa and made into a slave to eventually becoming a justice on the Supreme Court in 1967. He was the first African American Supreme Court justice. That's important to remember. You need to remember that. But you also need to remember the role that he played in what we're going to be talking about next. So let's talk about the topic that brought these individuals together in a courtroom. Remember that Plessy versus Ferguson had laid out the principle of separate but equal, right? That segregation, according to that Supreme Court decision back in the 1890s, was legal as long as equal accommodations were provided for the separate races. Well, we've already touched on the fact, I think, that that wasn't really the case. It was heavy on the separate but light on the equal, usually. For example, in Clarendon, South Carolina, in the school system there, the school for the black kids, there were no toilets in the school. They had to use an outhouse. There was no running water. And there were no buses provided for black students, despite the fact there were 33 school buses provided for the white students. When parents there requested that a bus be provided for the students at the black school, they were told that black people don't pay enough in taxes to warrant that. So what happened was that kids had to walk to school, in some cases up to 8 miles, often crossing roads and railroad tracks and other dangerous obstacles for, a 5-year-old. And they were actually, the kids were required to pick up sticks along the way so they'd have something to burn for heat when they got there. So, yes, that's very separate, but by no means equal. Parents in that school district with the the help of the NAACP and their lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, challenged this in court. And that led to, well, it didn't, it coincided with several other cases. That Clarendon, South Carolina case was one of five lawsuits brought in the late 1940s, early 1950s on this topic. There was that one in South Carolina, there was one in Virginia, there was one in Delaware, there was one in Washington, D.C., which was segregated, and there was one in Topeka, Kansas. Kansas, of course, one of those states in the Midwest where there was segregation. The Kansas case, one of the people involved there, a guy named Oliver Brown, an African American, was suing the Board of Education because they would not allow his daughter to attend one of the all-white schools, while he was arguing that the black schools were inferior on many levels, so far as the accommodations, the curriculum, and safety, and various other things. Well, it was decided that all of these suits would be rolled into one, basically rolled into the suit against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. So the actual title of the case is really, really long, but for short, it is called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, because when they have the people who are doing the suing, they list all their names alphabetically, and his name came first alphabetically. So this case was well, the actual lawsuit came about in Kansas in 1951. The Supreme Court argument took place in 1954 with Thurgood Marshall as the main lawyer, the lawyer for the NAACP, and here he is with a couple of the lawyers for the various other litigants, part of the team. Marshall's strategy was not to attack the specifics of the case in any of these instances, but rather to attack the principle behind the law, that separate but equal principle. It could have been argued that, and some people would have argued that these individual boards of education and these individual cities and states, in order to comply with the law and with the Supreme Court ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, needed to spend money to improve the educational accommodations for the black children. However, Marshall argued that segregation in and of itself was unconstitutional, and that separate but equal was something that could not stand. Okay, he was arguing that the very act of segregation, the very act of taking one group of kids and culling them out and putting them off in a separate place from the main body of kids, in and of itself, is telling them they are not equal, and that in and of itself is going to go a long way towards psychologically damaging those children, ruining their self-esteem in their most formative years, so that that would follow them throughout the rest of their lives, and that this is in no way equal, no matter how separate that it is. To prove his point, Thurgood Marshall called on the expert testimony of two psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, alias Dr. Clark and Dr. Clark. Incidentally, they were the first two African Americans to obtain a PhD in psychology from Columbia University. They lived and worked and did their research in Harlem. And in the 1940s, they did some very interesting research. And that research centered around the doll experiment. What they had done in the 1940s is that they had taken kids from schools in New York City, African American kids and white kids, and shown them two baby dolls. You can see them there in the picture. Um, the difference being their skin color. Other than that, they were virtually identical. And the kids were brought in, shown the two dolls, and asked several questions about them, like which one of these is the smart one? Which one is the good baby? Which one is the bad one? Which one would you rather play with? Which one do you prefer? And the kids, almost all of them, chose the white baby as the one they preferred, as the smart one, as the good one, and the black baby as not as good, as being dumb and being misbehaved. So the white kids chose that way, and so did the black kids. That's the point of the experiment. That all the kids came away. Well, they came to the table because of the society around them. They came to the table with this preconceived notion that white is good and black is bad, even the black kids. All right, so you know you're not going to assume that the majority of black parents were telling their kids, "Hey, by the way, you're stupid and ugly and bad." No, they got that from the fact that they were treated differently, and the white kids as well were getting this message loud and clear. And this was presented as evidence of Thurgood Marshall's argument that the very act of segregating children reinforced the idea that the ones who were being put to the side were inferior, reinforcing that idea to all the kids and wrecking the self esteem of the ones who were being singled out. By the way, that study was recreated in 2006, more than 50 years after the Supreme Court case that we're talking about, in a study and a short film called A Girl Like Me. And the results were exactly the same. The majority of the kids chose the white baby as the preferred one and would point to the darkest baby as the one most likely to be dumb, misbehaved, and so forth, which demonstrates that in addition to segregation, there's plenty of stuff in our daily culture in the United States that reinforces ideas of race and inferiority to kids. And now for a reminder of how the civil rights movement and segregation and those things tied in to the larger picture of the Cold War. While the court was deliberating after they had heard all the arguments, they received a message from the administration of President Eisenhower, who told them that in their decision that they should factor in the fact that racial discrimination, quote, in the context of the present world struggle between freedom and tyranny, and then they mentioned that other countries, quote, cannot understand how such a practice can exist in a country which professes to be a staunch supporter of freedom, justice, and democracy. Now, I want to point out here that President Eisenhower was from Kansas, so he had grown up essentially around segregation, and to be honest, he did and said some things that indicated he was kind of uncomfortable uh, with uh, with African Americans. But as president of the United States, his primary goal was to stay ahead of Russia, right? And this whole idea that in the United States, the bastion of freedom and liberty, there could be legal racial discrimination was a blow against the U.S. on the world stage. The court's decision was unanimous, 9-0, in favor of Brown and the other litigants, essentially cementing the idea that segregation, separate but equal, at least so far as public education was concerned, was not constitutional. This officially ended school segregation. I say officially. It's another one of those de jure, de facto things. Segregation continued for a good 10 years or more. In some cases in the South, it was 15 years before school segregation stopped. It was the early 70s. Why is that? Because, in part, the ruling of the court said that segregation had to stop in schools, and that needed to be done, quote, with all deliberate speed, end quote. All deliberate speed. Deliberate doesn't just mean on purpose, by the way. Deliberate means slowly and taking your time. So, with all slow fastness, in other words. So that was a little bit of a mixed message and opened a bit of a loophole for many states and localities to put off implementing this decision. Now, another big important part, an important fact about this Supreme Court decision was this was the beginning of a long series of civil rights decisions that would be rendered by the Warren Court, that is, the Supreme Court, while Earl Warren was in charge. And turns out that despite the fact that Earl Warren was, he had a reputation for being extremely conservative, and he was. Conservative often means not wanting to change. He turned out to be extremely progressive when it comes to racial issues. Turned out to be a bit of a surprise to a lot of Americans who expected him to behave in a certain way, but then he didn't. Now, this is a little bit of an argument, I think, in favor of lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. The whole reason that the Supreme Court is the only thing that has a lifetime appointment, that is the courts, is the idea that the founders had, the framers of the Constitution, that if you don't have to worry about getting elected, you don't have to worry about getting reelected, you don't have to worry about losing your job, you can vote your conscience. You will be free to vote what you think is right without being tempted to make have political concerns enter in. Now, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. There have been a lot of times in history where the court has been divided by politics, by political approach. But this is a case where it worked the way it was intended to work.